In this book, we have many, many dragons and many, many Valyrian steel swords. And if you could ride one dragon and wield one sword, which would it be?
Well, if I could ride on one dragon, I might as well go with the biggest, which would be Balerion the Black Dread. He's the mega dragon in this early book. He's the only one that remembers Valyria past a certain point, because he was brought over from Valyria at a little before the doom of Valyria, and he's the biggest and meanest of the dragons that exist. If I could wield only one sword, I don't think it would be any of the Targaryen swords. It would be Dawn, the sword wielded by the Sword of the Morning, the heir of House Dane of Starfall, which is made from the metal from a fallen star. And who knows what magical properties fallen stars bring to Earth.
Well, there's a question here from, again, from somebody, I think who may be in the audience, from Crystal Phillips, who says, are there any scenes in A Song of Ice and Fire that you look back on and smile because they were just so much fun to write? I mean, that sounds like one, but it's not in A Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, are there any that you mentioned the first scene with Bran, are there any that really just give you a tingle when you look back on them?
There are certainly scenes that I remember, but they tend not to be the ones that are fun to write. They tend to be actually the ones that are painful to write. I mean, the hardest thing I ever wrote was the Red Wedding scene in A Storm of Swords. And I knew that was coming. I was enough of an architect there that I was building toward that scene. I've been building for that scene since the first book. But when I actually reached that scene, it was too painful to write. I couldn't write it. I skipped over it. It occurs about 2/3 of the way through A Storm of Swords. I skipped over it and I wrote the scenes that follow. I finished the entire book, and I hadn't written that scene yet. That was the last thing I wrote for Storm of Swords. I had to go back and make myself write it. And it's still emotionally, you become very attached to these characters, believe it or not. I know I have the reputation for gleefully killing some of them, but that's not entirely deserved. Sometimes it's very painful for me to kill them. They're my children, for good or ill. So that was a tough scene to write. Yeah. I do periodically enjoy, if I write something that I'm particularly proud of, that really is, that I think is a good piece of writing, that is vivid and evocative, then that gives me pleasure. But it might not necessarily be the scenes that you guys would particularly enjoy. Some of them are just quiet things about, I have to describe this landscape, and I sweat and rewrite it, and I finally get, this is a great description of three guys riding through a grassy meadow. I've gotten the sights and the sounds and the smells of the scene right to put you there. But it's not necessarily anything that ordinary readers or reviewers will ever, oh my God, there was such a beautiful description of the grassy meadow on page 314. So, but.
This is a question from Adrienne Modolo, who says, how is your workspace organized to write A Song of Ice and Fire? Do you have a corkboard like in police investigations, where you've noted all the Targaryens and all the Freys, says Adrienne? Give us a physical sense of how you write and where you write.
Well, I don't have a corkboard. I have maps now, because there's been a beautiful map book called The Lands of Ice and Fire. So I printed out those large-scale maps, and I keep them around me so I can refer to the maps from time to time. Most of the stuff is actually in my head. I do have computer files, with timelines on them, and that I put together over the years, and bits of this and bits of that I can consult from time again. It is sometimes a daunting task. More so nowadays than when I began back in 1991, because the world has become so much bigger and it's become so much more complex. In many ways, I followed the template of Tolkien. If you look at Lord of the Rings, everything begins in the Shire, and with the hobbits, And then as they leave the Shire, they get to Rivendell and they meet some more people. They pick up Strider, they pick up the rest of the Fellowship. But then from that point, they start to split up. First, they split into 2 groups, and then the 2 groups split into 3 groups, and et cetera. Well, I followed more or less the same map. I mean, if you look at Game of Thrones, everybody except Dany is together in Winterfell in the beginning. All the viewpoint characters are there. But then they start splitting. And Dany is still off by herself on another continent, but some of my people go to King's Landing, some of them stay in Winterfell, and then the people who go to King's Landing get separated from each other and they go in different. And every time a character goes off on a different tangent, they meet other supporting characters. So at this point, I'm really writing not a novel, but 12 intertwined novels, and each character is in a different place with their own antagonists, their own friends, their own secondary and tertiary characters surrounding them. And yes, that is very difficult to keep in my head. I maybe should have organized it all better when I began back in 1991, but
do you ever...
I never thought it would get to that. I mean, remember, I'd written 4 novels before this: Armageddon Rag, Fever Dream, Windhaven with Lisa Tuttle, Dying of the Light. I never had any problems keeping those characters in my head. I didn't need corkboards or anything. I just remembered it all. I had no idea, though, that when I got into this, that the size that it would eventually become. Fortunately, it's the age of computers. We have search and replace functions, and I can load up, my gigantic file and say, okay, what did I ever say about this character? And I go through. Even then, I make mistakes, and my fans, like you people, and even more obsessive people elsewhere, are always eager to point out whenever I've made a mistake. I have particular trouble with the color of people's eyes. And rather famously, I have a horse who changes gender between the first and second books. It's hard to do a search and replace for the sex of a horse. These errors do sneak in.
Do you ever find you've sort of painted yourself into a corner and you've set up a part of the world that then impedes your storytelling?
Yeah, that is the disadvantage of being a gardener. The architect never finds himself building closed rooms that go nowhere, but the gardener sometimes traipses down a branch and finds himself sitting all the way out at the end, realizing he can't get from that branch anywhere else. So sometimes I do go down byways and say, no, I think I took a wrong turn back like 3 chapters ago. Let me rewrite these chapters, or in one case, or remove these chapters. But I never destroy them. I keep them on my computer in case I see a way to put them in later. There's always that. There's rather famously from the last book that was published, As with Dragons, I had a chapter where Tyrion was moving down the River Royne and the Shy Maid, and I wrote this chapter where he meets a character called the Shrouded Lord, and it's a really good chapter. I mean, I like some chapters more than others. This is a terrific chapter, but it's an absolute dead end. Well, I don't know if it's a dead end, but it introduces like 3 additional layers of complication that I didn't think I actually needed. But I liked it so much, I kept trying to fit it in. At first I presented it straight, and then I said, oh, I can't fit it in. I'll present it as a dream. Tyrion has a dream, and he dreams that this happened to him, and it has portents. And then I split it up into like 8 dreams, and every Tyrion chapter, he dreamed a little bit of it. And finally I gave up and said, I have to rip out all this stuff. It doesn't do me any good. Someday, maybe when I finish the whole book, I'll publish that lost chapter as a little standalone.